to the next webinar called Logic and Religion, organized by the Logic and Religion Association. As you all probably know, our main goal now is not only to organize these excellent webinars each month. This is our today's scope, of course, but our main aim is to organize the third and later the fourth Congress, World Congress on Logic and Religion. And we hope that this time it will not be postponed anymore. So we will meet in India, in Varanasi, in November 2022. So everyone is invited. I would like to remind you that you can still join. In a moment, I will send you on chat the link to the website of our third Congress. So you can learn there that you can still submit even a paper because the event was postponed, so also the deadline for submissions is postponed too. So feel invited. And today I would like to introduce our chair, Stanisław Krajewski, who will introduce our guests for today, Professor Woleński and Professor Odifreddi, and an excellent and exciting topic for today. So, Staszek, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just mention that the technical director of our group is muting everybody except the those who speak, so don't be surprised that you are muted. So we have two very outstanding and accomplished scholars, Jan Woleński from Poland and Piergiorgio Odifreddi from Italy. And let me say a few words about them, and they will speak in this order about the topic, which is what are the arguments for atheism. But I will say some remarks before they begin. But first, let me introduce the speakers. So both are very important and very active in their respective countries, and very active as in the public scene, also politically in many ways. Jan Woleński, he studied law and he turned to logic and philosophy, and since then he has been the main expert on the so-called Lwów-Warsaw School of Philosophy, and he's sort of one of the main figures continuing the work in philosophy in this spirit. And he was working for many years at the Jagiellonian University, the oldest university in Poland, and a very active and honored in many ways, and a member of the most prestigious scholarly bodies in Poland, like the Polish Academy of Sciences and another academy, a scholarly academy based in Krakow, and also a member of many international bodies in analytic philosophy and groups and organizations. He is the author of hundreds of papers and several dozen books, including Logic and Philosophy in the Lwów-Warsaw School, and recently Semantics and Truth, which is published by Springer 2019, which shows his main interests, and also more to the topic of our today's webinar, Limits of Unbelief, a book published in Polish 15 years ago, but this is something that he will probably be mentioning today in English. Now, turning to Piergiorgio Odifreddi, he is a mathematician and much more than that, also a philosopher and logician. And he's the author of a very important monographic treatment of classical recursion theory. He was teaching at the University of Torino, Turin, and also at Cornell and other universities, and has written also dozens of books, not only on mathematics and logic, but also on science, culture, and other topics. Also very active in public life in Italy. On religious issues, he wrote, among others, The Gospel According to Science, which is religion and science. Another book, 2007, was Why We Cannot Be Christians, let alone Catholics, which shows his own attitude, although he had, a personal connection to Catholic education as a young person. And finally, let me mention a book which is an exchange of letters with the then Pope Benedict XVI. And this exchange is called Dear Theologian Pope, Dear Atheist Mathematician. And so they are both, very uniquely prepared to speak about the topic, which is arguments for atheism. Before I give the floor to the speakers and then to everybody to continue our discussion, let me mention some points. So I think that the main argument for atheism is just that theism is not supported by good arguments. But as you know, many religious people would say the same. Yes, the theistic approach is not supported by good arguments, but that is why faith is needed. So, from the same situation, from a purely rational standpoint, when we need rational arguments, would be support, the argument against theism. But from the other point of view, it's just an argument that shows that faith is needed and theism is connected to faith. I would also say that that even atheists, although they differ, perhaps they share some assumptions, not the assumptions as theism assumes, but some other assumptions. Maybe one of the aims of a seminar like this one could be to analyze those assumptions that are hidden presuppositions of the atheist approach, which can perhaps be a problem for atheism. But anyway, the question is, can a philosopher and a logician say more than just say that there are no good arguments for the existence of God? If it's something more can be said, then we can benefit. Also, I would also say that in general, atheism is not very general, usually. Most often, I think, atheism means that somebody is revolting against the religious outlook that he or she has inherited or is dominant in the society where one is living. And it's not necessarily the same sort of atheism in each case, because it depends on the surroundings and the inherited concept of God. If so, those atheisms are different, and so it means that attacking one may miss the other approach to theism or to atheism. Of course, it's been for a long time established that there are no absolute proofs for theism, the thesis about the existence of God. But I do think that it still does not mean that there are absolutely no arguments for. But this is another point. This is not for today. For today, we are looking at trying to analyze arguments for atheism. But my last question to the speakers and to all of us is, if we have arguments for atheism, does this also mean that we have arguments against the need for spirituality? If so, okay, that's one thing. But if not, it means that spirituality or spiritual needs are something that we should see, you know, as something serious. And that question is whether those arguments for atheism also are arguments against anything in the realm of the spiritual quest, or is it also weakening that quest? Okay, so we have this field, and I will ask first Professor Woleński, who is a little bit senior. I mean senior in terms of age, and that's why I'm asking him first to speak, and then Professor Odifreddi. Professor Woleński, the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a difficult question because atheism and theism are, so to speak, contextually related, and it is very difficult to argue for one or second without addressing to its opposition. It is no exceptional situation because in general in philosophy is the same. So if we, for example, discuss or argue for materialism, so it is impossible to avoid allusions to idealism and reversely, and almost every philosophical problem is similar. I personally I am interested in just in philosophical aspects of theism and atheism. However, the important consequence of this contextuality is that both parts formulate or develop arguments positive, that is directly supporting their position, for example, that God exists. In the case of atheists, this is much more difficult. I will return to this problem for a while. And negative is more frequently directed against opponent. So I will concentrate on the arguments for atheism related to what we can say proofs or proofs as deductive inferences and or justification by empirical data taken from science or even ordinary life. And as you mentioned, contextuality of this debate requires to say once again, to account arguments proposed by the opposite party, in this case by theism. So the controversy concern, formally speaking, a sentence one, God exists, for instance, God as proposed by Christianity or similar religions, and this is accepted by theists and rejected by atheists, but this is a preliminary formulation. And consequently, the atheist asserts, second sentence, God doesn't exist. Now, because negative statements cannot be proved except some special cases, I mean deductively proved, for example, except showing that they are contradictory or internally contradictory or contradict some accepted assumptions, axioms, for example. The onus probandi, the burden of proof, belongs to the theist. The atheist in this context can only point out the theist proofs are incorrect. Now, first general remark. According to rejecting this sentence, God exists, it is possible to say, firstly, I do not assert this sentence, but without asserting the second sentence that God doesn't exist. It is a part of position of agnosticism. Usually it is supplemented also by a statement which says that I don't assert that God doesn't exist. That is not a deeper analysis of the relation between theism, atheism, and agnosticism requires to combine with them with such epistemic operations as I know, I believe. I take a simple course and identify atheists with two. However, I will make some remarks about belief and knowledge at the end of my talk. And second remark, some atheists claim that the concept of God is inconsistent. However, it can be answered that the standard concept of consistency does not apply to God. For instance, logically speaking, that his theory is paraconsistent. I will not enter into this question. I think that all parties can stay with classical logic. In particular, atheists can argue for this position without appealing to inconsistency of God. However, I agree that divine properties are difficult or even impossible to be fully expressed by ordinary or scientific concepts. That is another question, a question of understanding. Perhaps we return to this problem in the discussion. More detailed logical analysis. Let us agree that the term God, name God, is a proper name, since the atheists argued that this name is empty. He or she cannot use one, the sentence God exists, because it has no standard form of further logic. So we can transform into there is no such X, that X is God, which can be understood either as there is no X such that X belong to the denotation, to the set being a denotation of the predicate God, or there is no X such that X is identical with God. And the second statement expresses monotheism, but the former does not exclude polytheism. For simplicity, I will simply comment on is God without considering it is so-called general name or common noun or proper name. Now, this advantage of this new formulation is that it doesn't depend on the assumption that exist is a predicate. This is a this was a Kant's argument against ontological proofs of God existence. So it is a, I think that if the discussion assumes minimal set of presuppositions, it is much better. So I will discuss this in framework of standard logic. So, logically speaking, the atheist says that the predicate is God is empty, and theist says something opposite. It is not empty. Now, the position of atheists, atheist claims to the theist, please demonstrate that the predicate is God under a given explanation of God's properties, but it is not a problem of atheists to realize this claim, is not empty, that there is X such that X is God. As we know, several proofs of God's existence were offered. One important point is that atheist cannot deductively prove his statement as negative statement for obvious reason that negative statements are, particularly negative existential statements, are not proved except the case of being contradictory, but so we must prove that they are contradictory. For example, if atheist says that God's properties are inconsistent, it must be proved in a way. Now, as we know, we have cosmological and ontological proofs. There's no time to enter into details, so only a few remarks. Let's consider briefly one of Aquinas proves that now the premise every being has a cause doesn't entail that there is the cause of all beings. Yes, and it can be logically demonstrated. Of course, theists can say, well, but I use also some additional premises, for example, taken from cosmology, which exclude infinite causal chains. However, the question is moved to another region, namely whether cosmological models admit first cause or not, or don't need that. And the second problem is that we must demonstrate that this, or justify at least that this first cause is identical with God, what is not easy. Typically, as far as I know, the theist exaggerates the role of cosmology and simply say that cosmology implies that they must be transcendental, extra world cause. However, cosmology, as far as I know, doesn't claim something like that. Even if some cosmologists say that, well, the standard model with this first peculiarity is correct or not. The same situation is this premise, all beings are contingent, is very easily shown even via logical square for modalities, that this statement doesn't imply that there is a necessary being. So it was probably this argument was based on confusion of two kinds of contingency. Now, much difficult problem, serious problem is with ontological proofs. They are much more interesting from the logical point of view. However, all ontological proofs from Anselm to Gödel say something like that. Because God is necessary being, or a necessary or the necessary being exists, then God exists. However, the problem is proving that God is necessary. So it is an important premise, and if we do that, or if a proponent of ontological proof does this job, so it must use first order model logic and some principles which are their logical status is unclear. For example, Gödel's rule or Leibniz rule. So inference from A is true to the conclusion that every truth is necessary. It is a special premise which is not obvious. And as Staszek said, to sum up, consequently, the atheist says to the theist, because you do not prove that God exists, I assert that God doesn't exist. Of course, this conclusion does not preclude that the satisfactory proof can be given in the future. However, there are arguments that such a proof is difficult, but atheists can claim, this is what is now more positive, that the language of theology is radically different from the language of science. So it is dubious whether proof or empirical justification can be formulated in such a language. In particular, it seems that properties of God must be radically different than beings from this our world investigated by science or accessible by ordinary experience. So embedding the concept of God into cosmology looks as combining two radically incomparable languages subjected to complete different modes of experience. This opinion is not dependent on the assumption that the language of God is meaningless. I would like to stress this. I understand this language, I can criticize. Maybe I don't understand to the completely. I can criticize logic of this argument, so I don't share the view of logical empiricists that everything what we say about God is simply meaningless because it's not empirically testable. However, to use the ancient saying, res ad principia venit, and depends on many meta-theoretical assumptions about language, about logic, about consistency, inconsistency, and so on. And one must decide whether, for example, these two languages are comparable, if yes, in which region, and in which cases are incomparable. So this famous slogan that fides querens intellectus is very far from being obvious. Now, the atheist should answer several objections of the theist. I mean, I still stay in problems which can be formulated by logic. For example, one is problem is was stated by Dostoevsky in Brothers Karamazov, a famous statement: if there is no God, everything is permitted. And it is one of arguments that if an atheist is correct, so morality is impossible. But it's fallacious argument, bad argument, because it violates Hume's principle that is doesn't imply ought. So this argument is sound if we demonstrate that God something ordered, but it must be decided on the basis of, for example, sent books, religion, and contacts between God and human beings, and so on. So it is not obvious that God something ordered, legally or morally. One reason is also because various religions make various claims on this topic. So when there is a question in which way we can choose the proper answer. So now another question, and stated by Staszek, was whether a secular view, purely secular view, justifies morality of natural law. Of what it is another story, but I can, as a lawyer, say that legal systems don't need to be justified by goodwill. And now, the next point is that that it seems that the theist cannot know whether God exists under the standard meaning of knowledge as a true justified belief, but something similar can be said about the status of the position of atheists. Why? Because according to atheists, the concept of God, or the name God, is explained by attributes or properties of God which are transcendental or supranatural. So of course, atheists can criticize, but his positive view concerning transcendental God is difficult to be formulated. Is a reason that position of atheist is mostly negative. I know that so-called new atheists will not agree with this position. However, I think it is also that this new atheist is based on a meta-theoretical assumption that the concept of knowledge is taken from science, particularly natural science. If we make such an assumption, so of course the further argumentation is very thin, because really by assumption science doesn't speak about God. Now theist can yet say, well, but I am justified by my faith. The atheist might answer, okay, but I am not epistemically obliged to share your faith. And eventually add, invoking faith moves as to a different epistemic level than that associated with science. Additionally, it is worthy to remark that the text very frequently confuses two concepts of believing, namely beliefs based on scientific knowledge or ordinary knowledge, and beliefs based on religious faith. In the case of Christianity, we can very easily identify when it started, when Augustinus said about vera religio, true religion. So, historically speaking, terms like pistis, belief or faith in Greek, and fides in ratio were not necessarily connected with religion. Pistis were contrasted with latreia, was a religion as a ceremony, and in Latin, fides with ratio. So Augustinus combined these two concepts. So, if so, we should distinguish, I believe in God because my religious faith dictates that, and I believe in God because my religious faith dictates that. But there are, two different meanings of religion. She mentioned the difference of two languages, religious and scientific, is related to the difference in two kinds of believing. It is the old theory, two magisteria, or two kinds of truths, so-called Latin Averroism, claim that there are two not overlapping. There's a problematic point that not overlapping at all, but partially overlapping, not overlapping. And I came to the end. So the entire reasoning consists in epistemic, rational, but without any superiority. Rational is not an evaluative term, but only defined, like in Poland, for example, by Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz, anti-irrationalism, namely that based on ordinary or scientific means of communication and reasoning. So I don't, or this position doesn't deny that theism or religion has no reasons or ground, but they are psychological, sociological, maybe moral for other people. Of course, atheism, contrary to agnostics, is, for example, strongly assumes naturalistic point of view. Now, I didn't prepare this topic, but a brief answer to Staszek about spirituality. I see no particular advantage to say that similarity is imposed by God. It is difficult to explain spirituality in purely secular terms. However, ordinary experience shows that atheists are not devoid of spirituality. So there's empirical argument. So to my spirituality, to doing my duties, to believing in values, I don't need the help of God. If someone requires such a justification, I say, okay. However, there is a problem how to solve conflicts.
Okay, thank you very much, because now I think we should move to the second presentation. Professor Odifreddi.
So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me here. I have to make a disclaimer, first of all. Namely, I am or have been a mathematician, but certainly I'm not a philosopher. So I can talk about the topic today, only from the point of view of the layman, so to speak. Although I have a strong interest in the subject since I was a child, actually mostly when I was a child and when I was an adolescent. And then I lost interest, and only in more recent years I rediscovered, so to speak, the interest. Probably because I'm going backwards, And so I'm approaching the end, And we know that approaching the end is, becoming like a child again. But first of all, I would like to explain what, to me, not in a philosophical sense, so just in an intuitive sense, what atheism is to me. Somebody said already today, probably both of you, that there are many kinds of atheisms. Namely, there is one atheism for every religion. So, namely, somebody could say, I don't believe in that particular God. But those are imperfect notions of atheism, so to speak. They're relative notions. I prefer to talk or to think in terms of a perfect notion of atheism, which is not believing in any God, right? And the best reason I see for this kind of perfect atheism is simply that when we're born naked, so to speak, but literally in the sense that we have no clothes, but also metaphorically in the sense that we have no ideas. And in particular, we have no ideas of God, right? So every child, when he's born, is a perfect atheist. He doesn't believe in any God. And then many people most of the people, perhaps, I don't know, majority perhaps, most of the people, they acquire a faith, which is usually, as again, as already been said today, is usually the faith of your parents or your relatives, or at least, the state in which you're born or your culture, and so to speak. And this is, to me, already an argument for atheism, because if you were born in a different state or in a different time or in a different family, you would probably believe in a different God. And so, I mean, that's not a very good reason that you believe in a God simply because somebody taught you to do it, right? And it seems to me, that my attitude toward religions is exactly that. Those are cultural expressions, they're social expressions. They all belong to, they have a place, to speak scientifically, so to speak, by using just scientific terminology. They have a place in space and time. It depends on where you live and when you live, right? And the notion of God changes even inside a particular specific religion. I think that the idea that we have in Jesus Christ, for example, since we're in Europe, right, and we're both in Catholic, at least formally, Catholic countries, that is Italy and Poland, right? But Jesus Christ, was thought differently at the beginning of the century, or a few centuries ago, for example, in the Middle Ages. Not to speak about what Christianity was in Palestine at the beginning of the story. And so, I mean, when people ask me, for example, do you believe in God? And some people actually do sometimes, and during your lifetime, probably all of you have been asked this question. My first reaction is not to say yes or no, but to answer back, so which God do you mean? And then if you tell me the God you intend, right, with your question, then I can say most probably no, right? But not necessarily. So it might come as a surprise that even an atheist could say yes to the answer if you believe in God. if the question is specified in a certain manner, in a certain way, so to speak. For example, do we believe that there are truths, for example, or not just absolute truth, but at least, some kind of truth? Do we believe that there is something that transcends us, right? Well, of course, it depends on the meaning of transcendence, but certainly, I don't believe, that I'm the end of the story, so to speak, right? I belong to a race, for example. I belong to, in the sense of a human race, right? I'm an animal, right? So I belong to life in a certain planet, right? I belong to the universe. And so the notion of transcendence has many layers, right? And when somebody says, for example, that, what is science after all? If you don't believe that there is a truth, right? And then it wouldn't make any sense to look for this truth. And science, after all, is just the idea, the trial of finding some truths around you, regarding, of course, the world that in which we live in, world intended as a universe, not just the small world even of the earth, right? So I think that the scientific quest, in a certain sense, can be considered as a religious quest, or better, since we use this word, as a spiritual quest. I remember that when Einstein was asked the question whether science could be spiritual in a sense, it was at a meeting, a congress on religion and science. So, that was the appropriate place to answer this question. He actually said pretty boldly that he thought that not only there was no contradiction between science and spirituality, but that for what he saw around him at the time, and I think even more today, he saw that the world was so materialistic, was so involved with questions that had nothing to do with spirituality, that the only people that he thought would actually be interested in spirituality nowadays would just be the scientists. And in a sense, this is to me a very good and influence answer. That is, in a sense, science is probably today the only quest for what times ago was called the spirituality, right? So far from being contradictory, the two notions, scientific truth and spirituality, I think they're just complementary. And today, certainly, many religions, and I think Ian already said it in his talk, many religions don't seem to have any spirituality at all. When take the Vatican, for example, which is the closer example that I have here in Italy. They're involved in very materialistic enterprises, banks, for example, and all sorts of other quests, right? And many times, I think, that when I hear a priest speak, or even a pope, for that matter, it seems to me, that all that is very far from spirituality. And conversely, when I hear many scientists that think, for example, to answer questions like the origin of the world, the origin of life, the origin of consciousness, all those questions were in the past philosophical and religious questions. But nowadays, we just consider them as scientific questions, and the answers that science tries to give are much deeper than those given by religion. Because, for example, those three main questions that I just quoted, namely the birth of the universe, the birth of life, and the birth of consciousness, many religious people would have an answer for the three questions, which is just the same answer. The universe exists because God created it. Life exists because God created it. Consciousness exists because God created it. It's the same answer that incidentally doesn't answer anything. There's just a name. You call the mystery using another mystery. And actually, this is what a Polish writer once said. Stanislav Lem, that I think he defined God, the substitution of something that you don't understand with something that you understand even less, right? So it's a very bad way of answering philosophical questions or metaphysical questions. Now, since I just spoke the bad word, to me at least, that is metaphysics, I would like to say that my attitude, for example, for what it's worth, towards atheism is not just a refusal of religions. Namely, for me, religions are just one example of a much more broad concept, which is metaphysics. And I consider my atheism as a profession of faith against every kind of metaphysical notions. Now, the interesting thing is that science in general and mathematics and logic in particular have proved or disproved that some metaphysical ideas are either inconsistent on one side or at least undefinable, ineffable, one could say in theological terms, on the other side. Take truth, for example, which of course, is something that many religious people often try to identify with God. For example, Jesus Christ, he presented itself, as being the way and the truth. La verità e la vita, we say in Italian, right? Well, we have a Polish logician, Tarski, who proved, using the methods of God, that truth does not exist, or at least, the truth is not definable inside a language. So you have to get out of the language to talk about truth. You can talk about relative truths. You have, for each level of the language, of the hierarchy of the language, you do have partial truths, but there's no absolute truth. Or thanks, for example, in physics, the notion of reality, which is another one of those big metaphysical words. You usually identify metaphysical words because they have a capital letter at the beginning, right? So, and instead, when there is a small letter at the beginning, they don't belong to metaphysics. So there are many truths with the lowercase t, but there is no truth, with a capital T. And I was saying, even in physics, the notion of reality has been disproved in a certain sense, because if you define it sufficiently formally, as Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen did, well, then you can actually prove, that reality does not exist in that term. Or democracy, for example, again, with a capital D. There's a theorem by Kenneth Arrow, who got the Nobel Prize for Economics for this theorem, that disproves the existence of democracy if you assume that democracy has a minimal set of properties that we all would consider to be necessary for the concept to exist, right? So there is this quest, which is an anti-metaphysical quest, it seems to me, especially, which is very typical of the last century, the 1900s, right? And it is a quest which goes against metaphysics in general. So just to repeat, Tarski, for example, or Einstein and Bell, or Arrow, and so on, they all go in this direction. And that's a profession of atheism, in the sense, in this general sense that I was trying to describe, that is not just related to the metaphysical notions of religion, but in general, all metaphysics. Now, of course, this is talking about my particular view of atheism. But if one wants to follow a bit, the steps that Ian already took half an hour ago, it's interesting to see the proofs of the existence of God that have been proposed during the history, at least of the Western culture. There have been proofs also in some Eastern philosophies or theologians, if we want to call them that, right? But we could just hint briefly at St. Thomas's proofs. Now, that's very easy to disprove those proofs. First of all, the main argument would be that he gave 5 principal proofs or ways, as he called them, right? And I mean, they have nothing to do with the notion of God that any believer would actually have, right? I mean, if you ask, somebody who goes to church in our countries and say, do you believe in the first cause or in the last goal, the last end? I mean, nobody would actually identify those notions with Jesus Christ or even with the idea of God that they have. So, I mean, you can certainly try to prove the existence of the first cause if you want, but then, I mean, you prove something that has to do with philosophy and not with religion, which are 2 different things. It's a concept, an interesting concept for that matter, or even the ontological proofs, the Anselmus's proof. That's, we all know, it's 900 years that logicians, first theologians and then logicians, are struggling with that proof, But if you ask somebody, that says, do you believe in God? Yes. And I define God, as, somebody who can say something or somebody of which we cannot think anything bigger, I mean, I think that the reaction of a believer, would just be, well, that's good for you, but that's not the God that I believe in. So those proofs, they certainly do something, but they don't prove any existence of they don't prove the existence of any God that any believer would actually identify as such. And the interesting thing is that it's not only missing the target, so to speak, but there are also proofs which are very easy to dismantle because they all have the same structure. They all use reduction to absurdum, so the impossibility of a regress to infinity, which was okay during the scholastic period, because nobody, or at least few people, would believe in the consistency of the notion of infinity. But nowadays, we just think in the opposite way. That is, we even start, when we study mathematics, with the notion of infinity, right? And so a proof that just is based on the refusal of the notion of infinite regress, wouldn't prove anything nowadays. Moreover, it's not only the existence part that is faulty, but it's especially the uniqueness part. Because especially for people like the Europeans or the Catholics who believe that there is only one God, even the Islamic, for example, of course, it's a different God, that's already a problem, when 2 people say, I believe in the only God that exists, and they think that the 2 gods are different, so it's already a self-defeating assertion, so to speak, on their parts, right? But there was no attempt on St. Thomas's part to prove that the 5 gods that he actually proved, so to speak, the existence of were actually the same God. So there's no uniqueness. And moreover, and this is the most important thing to me for the Catholic faith, moreover, any of those 5 gods would have absolutely no relationship with Jesus Christ. So there's a big gap, between talking about those 5 gods. And actually, I say 5 just to be kind to St. Thomas, because, for example, the first cause, we all know that it all depends, on the way you actually do the regress to infinity. But nobody says, that if you start with an object, and then you look for the cause of the object, and then for the cause of the cause of the cause, and so on, or if you start with a different object and you do the same thing, in the end you will get to the same God, right? And indeed, Aristotle thought, he actually computed the number, I think, of possible first causes. I forgot what the number was. One was 55. He was not sure. He had 2 answers, and I think one was 47 and the other was 55, right? But so you see, it's all a mess, and from the modern point of view, even logically, those proofs don't prove anything. They don't prove the existence of only one first cause. They don't prove the existence of only one God defined in 5 different ways. They don't prove the coincidence or the identity of those 5 gods with Jesus Christ. So it's a very shaky enterprise, right? But to me, the most interesting thing is when you take these things and reverse them upside down, as Hegel did with, as Marx did with Hegel, right? And I'm referring to something that is quite new, in a sense, at least, in biblical time. Right, namely, just a few years ago, in 2006, there was this meeting in Vienna for the first centennial of Gödel's birth. And I remember that there were discussions there on the ontological proof in the version that Gödel. Sorry, I was thinking of Gödel, but of course, since incidentally, just in parentheses, Gödel is a strange name because it's made of two syllables, which is the first one is God, and the second one is El, which are two names for God in two different languages. You put them together, you get Gödel, right? And so it's appropriate that he actually discussed theological things. And incidentally, Gödel was a believer. He had strict beliefs in not only in theology, but also in other parts of metaphysical, let's call them questions, right? But in any case, in that meeting, 2006, there were discussions about this proof, which was a logical proof, right? And you can actually rephrase Gödel's proof in a very simple way. Once you discover that Gödel made a mistake, so this is so wonderful, because with somebody like God El, somebody who has an almost divine proportion for all the logicians and probably the philosophers today, right? Sometimes he did make a mistake. And more than a mistake, this was an imperfection, let's call it so. Namely, he tried to give a proof of the existence of God in the framework that St. Anselmus, the ontological proof, had given, with all the objections that had been given, in particular by Descartes first, and then by Leibniz, and especially since Gödel was interested in Leibniz. And I can say a little anecdote about this, which has little to do with religion, but it has to do with Gödel. It was told to me by Gerald Sachs, who was a great recursion theorist who knew Gödel very well. And he told me that once he was talking to Gödel about something, and Gödel quoted Leibniz. And he also added, Leibniz was the greatest philosopher of all. And then he said, of course, on this point, it was wrong, right? I mean, they were discussing about something. And then Gödel stopped for a moment and he said, not only, it was always wrong. And so... And so Sachs, asked him, how is it possible that somebody is the greatest philosopher, and he's always wrong? And apparently Gödel said, well, to be always right is impossible. To be sometimes right and sometimes wrong, we're all capable of doing this, right? But so the next best thing that you can do is to be always wrong. You cannot be always right. Everybody can be sometimes right, sometimes wrong. So if you're always wrong, it's almost like being always right. Also because you just reverse the truth value of everything you say, and you get truth, But anyway, just closing the parenthesis, right? Well, Gödel was trying to use modal logic because Leibniz was interested in that. So he was trying to prove that not only God exists, but that it necessarily exists. And so he devised a particular model system, of a formal system of modal logic, and he gave his proof in this model system. Now, the imperfection was that this model system collapses, actually. So necessary and true, they just become the same thing. So there's no reason to use necessities or possibilities in that system, since they're just true and false, right? And so if you just dismantle all the modal apparatus of the Gödel's proof, you get a very simple proof of the existence of God, which amounts to say that there is a certain ultrafilter, right? And you put down axioms to say that the ultrafilter does not collapse, right? So it's not trivial, right? and that there is, it's actually a principal ultrafilter. So the generator of the ultrafilter would actually be what Gödel in one sense and Leibniz on the other sense, thought would define God. Now, the interesting thing was that when Harvey Friedman heard of those proofs and saw that you could prove the existence of God by using a particular ultrafilter, right? Then he thought that, as I said, you could turn everything upside down. Namely, he said, well, we all know that if you have sufficiently strong ultrafilters, then first of all, it's difficult to prove that they exist, but you can actually use the assumption of the existence of those ultrafilters to prove the consistency of certain theories. In particular, there is a big ultrafilter, and you can put as an axiom the fact that that ultrafilter exists, and you will be able to derive the consistency of ZFC, for example, of set theory, right? Or if you wish, even of bigger theories, you just have to isolate the appropriate ultrafilter. And so Friedman actually did the opposite. He said, if God exists, in the sense, that there is a particular ultrafilter that has the following properties, which is similar to the ultrafilter that Gödel used in his proof of the existence of God. So if God exists, then mathematics is consistent. So that's a much more interesting thing. You're not trying to prove the existence of God, but you're trying to justify the existence of mathematical truth in sort of a theological sense. And those things I find much more interesting, so to speak, than trying to prove or disprove, for that matter, the existence of God. So in a sense, you understand, that my approach to religion is not to take those things very seriously. Of course, you don't disprove the faith of anybody. If somebody says, I believe, there's nothing you can say, that's a psychological statement, and if you believe in certain things, that's good for you, right? But it's very, I don't see much the purpose, so to speak, of trying to prove the existence of God, because nobody would be convinced in any case, right? Lulus, for example, he thought that he could actually go to the Muslim countries, and provide a proof, of the truth of Christianity, right? And a mathematical proof, right? And it was a proof, sort of a mechanical proof, that he devised this a machine, with many wheels, mechanical wheels, And then he did go to the Islamic countries, and of course, he was decapitated there, and he lost his life. It was not very successful. Leibniz, for example, had the same purpose. When he discovered the binary arithmetic, just based on 0 and 1, he thought that this was a very good proof of the existence of God, right? Of the way that God actually used to produce the world. Because you start with 0, which is nothing, and you start with 1, which is God, of course, and then you put them together, and almost miraculously, you get all the numbers, in binary representations. And then what he did, was to write to the Jesuits that lived in China, the missionaries, and that many Jesuits were actually scientists, right? In particular, Ricci, who was the Italian, who went there, and he was a mathematician on one side and a theologian on the other side. But Leibniz wrote to his contemporaries, Jesuits, and to say, you could use this, to as a tool, to convert the Chinese to Christianity. Now, of course, first of all, there's no relation to Christianity in binary arithmetic, right? But the most distressful thing for Leibniz was that the Jesuits replied, well, what you just discovered, was known here since 2000 years ago, because the I Ching were actually based on binary representations, of the sticks, on full sticks, and split sticks, So even Leibniz did not succeed, and I don't think that we can use reason to disprove faith, or reason to convert atheists to religion. So my attitude is and I think, that this was Borges who said it once, that theology is just a branch of fantastic literature. Now, if you put it like that, then it becomes much more interesting. And that's what I do. I read books of theology as if they were fantastic literature books, and I enjoy them. Then, of course, if you tell the authors of those books, that they just wrote fantastic literature, sometimes they don't take it very well. For example, that's what I did with Benedict XVI in the book, that you quoted at the beginning, Dear Pope, I'm writing you. And I said, in one chapter that theology was just a branch of fantastic literature. And of course, he didn't take it very well. And he actually tried to fight back, by saying, well, science is the similar thing. And he quoted he had a quotation from Monod, Case and Necessity, Chance and Necessity, in which he was saying that there was a fish that became, a terrestrial animal by developing legs from the branches that he had here. He quoted this page and he said, you wouldn't say, that this is less fantastic literature than theology, right? So that's my attitude, and I don't know whether this is of any use, to those who are listening to us, but I'm willing, of course, to answer more questions in more detail if there are any for me. So thank you for the attention for now.
Thank you very much. So we had two presentations, and of course there are many, many topics that have been covered. I'm just thinking how to proceed now. Maybe if there are specific questions to the speakers, we would start with that, because I understand that many of us would be able to give one's own presentation, but maybe this is not something we should begin with. So either a specific question to one of the speakers or to both, or perhaps a problem or an issue that has completely been ignored so far. So I see two people who want to ask the question. So first, Ali Sadek Dagigi, please.
Hi everyone. Hi George. Long time no see. Nice to meet you again. And thanks to organizer for this nice program. My question concerns your argument about Tarski's undefinability of truth theorem, that you potentially gave it, as far as I understand, you gave it in support of your argument against the existence of any form of absolute being or something that resembles God. Don't you think that such theorems in mathematics and also in physics, such as Tarski's undefinability of truth or Gödel's incompleteness theorems, or maybe Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, and things like that, actually shake the absolute ground that the physics and mathematics rely on, and open the gate for any form of spiritual exploration of the universe, or actually they are in support of God and against any form of too materialistic and too absolute understanding of the universe? Could you please elaborate on this point?
Okay, thank you. So please, Professor Odifreddi.
Oh, absolutely. There are certainly people that interpret those results in the way that Ali just said, in particular Gödel's theorem, because the easiest way to express Gödel's theorem is to say that there are truths which are unprovable. And then, of course, somebody says, oh, you see, you want to prove things, you want to restrict yourself to reason, right? So the only things that you could see in mathematics would be things that you can prove, right? But by Gödel's theorem, there are truths which are not provable, so you have to transcend mathematics, or they say to transcend reason, and hence, what do? You have to get into spirituality or even religion, right? But of course, this is, I think, that this is a misinterpretation of Gödel's theorems. It's a nice way of saying them, right? But and it's exactly the same thing when you talk about physics, for example. And many physicists, they talk about the Big Bang. And people think, that the Big Bang is something that actually happened in space-time, at a certain in a certain point, and at a certain time, there was this explosion. But the Big Bang is just the limit that you go to, right, or towards when you actually look at the film of the universal history backwards, right? So in the case of Gödel's theorem, what Gödel says is that if you have a formal system which is consistent, then you have statements that you cannot prove and you cannot disprove. Now, that has nothing to do with truths, right? Because it actually avoids completely the notion of truth with good reason, because otherwise, you would need the notion formally, and by Tarski's theorem, you could not use it, right? So I think it's a misinterpretation of those arguments to use, or actually even to phrase them in a way that would actually become a support for a spiritual or a theistic approach, right? But on the other hand, I think that, and I wanted to say this before and I forgot, so that's a good place to say now, namely the negative proofs. Because usually when we discuss God, we discuss positive proofs that have been proposed to prove the existence of God, right? And people think that intuitively, it's very difficult to prove the non-existence of something. I mean, you can prove the existence, you show it, right? But how do you prove the non-existence? But indeed, in mathematics, this has been done for forever, since 2,500 years, when Pythagoras, for example, discovered the existence of irrational numbers. And what is an irrational number? I mean, you prove, that there is no rational number that has a certain property, right? Then, of course, you can introduce those numbers as new numbers, right? The irrational numbers, but that's a negative proof. There is no rational number that has a certain property. Or if you think, for example, in terms of constructions by rule and compass, there is no construction of an heptagon. You cannot use only rule and compass to build a regular polygon with 7 edges, right? Or, for example, in the 1500s, and then, of course, in the 1800s, the fact that there are equations that you cannot solve using radicals. I mean, all those are negative proofs. And they are among the most interesting proofs. So I think that Tarski's proof, Gödel's proofs, and so on, many of those are negative proofs, which require, a more subtler interpretation, and that certainly cannot be used to back a spiritualistic approach. For example, in the case of the irrationals, in a certain sense, people try to do that. Because when you think that there is an irrational number, well, then of course you go against, I think, the Pythagorean approach, right? Because what is an irrational number? It's just a set of approximations, but it's a metaphysical step to step from the approximations to something that is what those approximations approximate. So it's introducing ideal elements, and that's exactly what they are called in algebra, for example. You take an ideal, right, and then you do the completion by ideals, right, and the fact that they're called ideals should underline the fact that those are not reals, not in the technical sense, but in the philosophical sense. So it's an interesting question of philosophy of mathematics, but it's a subtle question that probably can be misinterpreted in the way that Ali suggested.
Thank you very much. And I will continue, before giving floor to Ricardo, I will continue after your answer, because, you said at your first presentation to speak to Professor Odifreddi that you are against any metaphysics. And now you have just said that, irrationals are metaphysical occurrences,
course.
which you believe in, I understand. So to be against all metaphysics is not possible. Do you agree?
No, 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 no. We should not believe in the existence of irrationals. We should believe in the existence of approximations to something, right? Which, if you want to hypostatize it, then it becomes an ideal object. But otherwise, you can actually you can do the opposite. You can deconstruct, for example, the irrational numbers, and that's what the definitions of Dedekind and Cantor did. I mean, before them, people thought, that there were irrational numbers and real numbers, and they didn't know what they were, right? Or complex numbers, for that matter. But then you deconstruct them very easily. The complex numbers are just pairs or real numbers, right? You don't have to think, that there are numbers that if you multiply them, negative numbers, you multiply them by themselves, right? And so on. And so I would take the opposite stand. Namely, we should not make the mistake of rejecting metaphysics in certain areas and then, accepting them in mathematics. And it's much better to remember this, even if, unfortunately, when we teach mathematics, we tend to be metaphysical.
No, but please, so we are saying that no irrationals don't exist, really, only there are approximations. So my question is, you have a square with the side 1. So do you think that the length of the diagonal exists or not?
The length exists is the ratio. Certainly they both exist, but you cannot measure them. Incidentally, this is an interesting thing because it's the same thing. Somebody quoted, perhaps Ali, the indeterminacy principle. Well, the existence of the irrational numbers, and in particular the fact that the diagonal and the edge of a square are incommensurable, is exactly a first version, of the Heisenberg principle. It just says, that you cannot measure with the same stick, so to speak, both quantities. If you measure precisely one, you cannot measure the other, and more precisely, you want to measure the edge, and then you cannot do the. So, in a sense, we have to be very careful, and indeed, since we just hinted it with the name Heisenberg to quantum mechanics, even there, we have to be very careful. Because the Copenhagen interpretation is a completely idealistic interpretation of quantum mechanics. To say, that there's no reality, so in a sense, it's a complicated. The philosophy of mathematics today and the philosophy of physics require a certain sophistication, I think. And we should not make mistakes, that then we accuse others to do or to make in different areas. So both in mathematics and in physics, we have to be very careful not to play games with words, so to speak, which is my definition of metaphysics in a sense. My definition of physics is a la Quine, so to speak. Physics is the study of everything there is or everything that exists. And then metaphysics, of course, by consequence, becomes, the study of everything does not exist. So we have to be careful.
Okay, so to continue this, you said that the physics or science now says that the reality or the world is not really what we think it is. So in some sense, it doesn't exist. So. But at the same time, of course, we all believe that the world does exist. And the same to Professor Woleński, that you said that the question is whether God exists or not, and there are two answers, yes or no. But when we think about the question whether the world exists, then we don't really say that there are two possibilities. We say it does exist or it does not exist. We just assume it exists, even though when we go a scientific analysis, we continue a scientific analysis, it turns out that the idea of the world becomes very problematic, and it's not clear what the world really is or can be. So we can say that from a certain scientific point of view, the world does not exist, as as Professor Odifreddi already really did say explicitly. So the reality with capital R does not exist. So the parallel here is that, you know, about God we can say, okay, no God, because that it doesn't harm us. But when we say about the world, the reality, it does not exist, it becomes very problematic, because how can we live in the world which clearly does exist, as everybody knows? And so is this parallel illuminating or not? The question to both speakers.
Could I just quickly say, and then we'll let Ian answer, because I spoke too much. But in a sense, you know, it's even more problematic than that, because even in mathematics, we simply believe that numbers exist, right? 1, 2, 3. Actually, we know that we have neurons in the head, right, that are able to actually compute the small numbers without counting. That is, we have a neuron that tells us, you know, that there are 3 things or 4, and it goes more or less up to 4 or 5, you know, and then after that is constructed, you know. So when people ask, you know, whether mathematics is discovered or invented, you know, we could say, well, small numbers are discovered, but, you know, big numbers are invented. But certainly we can use singular numbers, individual numbers, or finite sets, right? But can we actually step from the natural numbers to the set of the natural numbers, which is, of course, you know, the big problem that had Cantor at the very beginning, right? And again, you know, now we know that we cannot, because the axiom of infinity is necessary in set theory. And it's perfectly consistent to have a finite model, the hereditarily finite sets, that satisfy all the axioms of ZFC, except for the axiom of infinity. So you have to take it for granted. So, but when you take something for granted, that is faith, right? I mean, the idea of logic was, I mean, no, we construct mathematics without taking anything from granted, because we all build it, you know, from logic. Then, you know, we would have to justify logic. But nowadays we know that at least something you have to assert. Incidentally, you also have to assert the existence of some set, in particular the empty set, because otherwise you don't go anywhere, right? So we have to be very careful when we talk about mathematics from an ontological point of view. I mean, von Neumann had a different attitude, much more realistic. You know, he said, "You don't understand mathematics; you just get used to it, right?" And it is the same thing, you know, when you play chess. I mean, you don't believe in the existence of the king, right? Or of the knight, you know. I mean, there's nothing to believe in, you know. Those are the rules, you play them, right? And if you like them, you know, you like them. Otherwise, you don't play the game. Mathematics, unfortunately, is very much like that, right? It's very similar. And otherwise, if you want to do a metaphysical interpretation of mathematics, you have to take axioms and believe in at least one infinity. Then you get many. By exponentiation.
And I think with religion it's similar. Now,
It's
Professor
similar.
Woleński. Professor Woleński.
Now I have only one remark. It's 30 minutes of discussion, and this is not on the topic which was announced. It's about philosophy of mathematics, physics,
Yes.
reality. I have nothing to do, because we assume that the world exists, and assuming that the world exists, we are asking about God. So I propose to return to the topic, because you know, there's a lot
That would be very interesting, yes.
There is a lot to say about Gödel, Tarski, and so on, but it is not related to the problem which was announced to discussion.
Okay, thank you. Now, Ricardo Silvestre.
Okay, thank you, Stan. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Professor Woleński and Professor Odifreddi for your talk. It was very, very interesting. So I have a question, and I mean, attending Stan's request to ask something about an issue which somehow was not well addressed. So I just, I'm sorry for that.
It's the intervention of God.
God? Oh, yes.
In the
Which
form
God?
of music.
perhaps he doesn't want me to talk. But I will talk anyway. See, as far as I could see, you both, perhaps Odifreddi mainly, you adopt a kind of deontological approach to believe, in the sense of Locke, that one is entitled to believe just if one has strong evidence in favor of this belief. Of course, many people had been against that, like Alvin Plantinga, for instance. But anyway, if I'm right on that, then being an atheist, I mean, or at least being rationally an atheist, implies that one must have good evidence, strong evidence for the existence of God. On the other hand, if you want to be a rational atheist, one has to have strong evidence against the existence of God. And mainly, Professor Odifreddi, you did something that has to be done. You analyzed many arguments for the existence of God, but I missed that, as far as I could see, you didn't bring to us arguments against the existence of God. And again, according to this approach, unless one does that, one would not be entitled to claim rationally that God doesn't exist. And this is very important because many philosophers nowadays, Richard Swinburne, for instance, they try to, because the whole issue is the rationality of theistic belief, right? And many philosophers right now, they compare both kinds of arguments. Here are the theist arguments. Here we have the atheist arguments. Let's compare them. Instead of saying that God exists, or there's a proof, I mean, we don't use this word anymore, proof. I mean, we can't prove, I mean, just in mathematics and logic, outside of that, we can't prove anything. But many philosophers, the philosophers, they are adopting the approach of trying to show, for instance, that theistic belief is more probable, say, than atheist belief, or the other way around. But in order to do that, we have to compare the available arguments that we have for and against the existence of God. So I would like to hear from you two about that.
Okay, thank you. That's a good question, I think, especially to Professor Woleński, if you want to answer.
No, okay, so assume that you are asking whether there is a mountain higher than Mount Everest, and say, give me evidence. Okay, so please measure. Ask someone who is competent to answer this question. Prove that or justify that round square don't exist. It is a contradiction. So evidence, I must know which level you claim to be discussed. For example, there is about 1 million or billion in US and non-believers. It is a considerable number of people, and it documents that religion is not necessary for living, good living, and so on, so on. It is a sociological argument that is not answers. It doesn't answer the question whether it is probability of existing God or not. However, we can continue. The problem for me is this. I make some meta-theoretical assumption concerning my knowledge. Ordinary people don't need to make them, except some particular extreme, for example, situation. Just before that, in dramatic circumstances, some Jewish people lost faith because Holocaust, because God treated this nation, and so on, so on. Now, according to this meta-theoretical standard, I think that Piergiorgio shares it, me too, that source of knowledge is mathematics and science, even including the humanities. And according to this meta-theoretical standard and related concept of knowledge or belief, God doesn't is not necessary in this framework.
Of course.
And that's all. There's not a problem of probability. There's not problem of such a being, because this being transcends our knowledge. So must be different reason. For example, personal faith, personal belief. I agree that for people who believe, it is sufficient. And this finishes discussion. Now, further, all concepts which are used in theology, in Christian theology, but not only, also in Judaism or in Islam, I mean, this main monotheistic religion, are very unclear. Creation from nothing. Vacuum is not a nothing in physics. Empty set is not nothing. It is something. So the concept of nothing is very difficult. Then we have analogies. God is stable, unchangeable. However, he acts. He creates something. It is, of course, another meaning of the word creates than in ordinary life. And if I limit my conceptual resources to science or ordinary life, I don't need the God. So it's not a problem of probability or something like that. Simply it is another perspective which is not unique, which is shared by millions of people. And if you discuss problems with theologians, I did several times, I mean Christian theologians, and explain me what is the relation between free will and properties of God. I can demonstrate, argue that properties of Catholic God or Christian God in general exclude free will. Not all the very popular and renowned theologian, priest Joseph Tischner told me, you are right, but you must believe in it. Is the end of discussion, because it is not my language. I respect his view and the view of anybody who argues in that, but it is not this language. The same is in other cases. The problem of evil. There's unending discussions whether God is consistent with evil or not. For me, for example, the problem is not existence of evil, because I can imagine theology which justifies evil and the existence of God, even Christian. However, for me, is a problem of distribution of evil. It is completely not consistent with any human picture of or idea of morality. Well, Holocaust, take what happened in Cambodia, what happened in the murdering of Gallic people by ancient hero Caesar, and so on, so on. So many awful. Natural explanation is okay, but if I hear that I am listening to, okay, God knows why evil is so distributed and not in another way. I cannot agree with this. However, I understand that if someone tell me, well, God knows better than you are not competent to evaluate or assess God's decision. Okay, it is your position, not mine. I believe what I can understand. This is my slogan.
Okay, thank you. So we have one more question, and the speakers will have the possibility of answering it, and that will probably be the time to finish, because some people have left already. Joseph Frankel has the floor.
Yeah. Yes, I'm wondering about the claim that God is infinite. Since infinity is infinite, how can God reach infinity? Wherever he reaches, there's always one more step to go.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe Professor Odifreddi would answer the question about actual infinity.
Well, yeah, I just wrote last year during the lockdown a book on infinity. So in a sense, I'm prepared. But the question is this, that when Cantor discovered that there were many infinities, that is, once you have one, and then you do exponentiation to the that infinity, you get something bigger. Right? He actually went to the Holy Office in Rome, because he was not Catholic, but he was Christian, despite the name, which would make one guess that he was of Jewish ascent. But he was raised Christian, Protestant. So he went to the Holy Office and asked the cardinal, who was a German cardinal, incidentally, as often in that place. It was called Franzeling, right? And he went there, and explained to him, said, look, your eminence, I discovered that there are many infinities, how does that agree, with Christian faith? I wouldn't like to be a heretical, right? And they took 2 years, I think, the Dominicans. So you know that the Dominicans were the ones who actually lit the match with for the fire, the Inquisition. So they studied the set theory, Cantor's set theory. And then he was summoned back to the Holy Office, and they asked him, say, okay, so you say that first of all, there are the natural numbers, right? 0, 1, 2, and so on, right? Yes. Then after that, there's a first infinity, right? There's an omega. Then there's omega plus 1 and so on, right? And then. And he said, yes. He said, but in the end, what is there in the end? Cantor said there's nothing in the end, because that's incoherent. It's a multitude, as he would call them. That is contradictory, self-contradictory. And they said, that is God. So you should call that infinite. And the other ones, you shouldn't confuse people. You should call them transfinite. We call them cardinals nowadays, so in a sense, it's even better for them, but so they're transfinite. So forth in theology, I think that the idea is that God is identified with absolute infinity, which for mathematicians is incoherent. So it's not rational. So there's no way to prove the existence of something irrational in any sense of proof, because proof has to be to do with rationality. So in a certain sense, this is a very good divide between mathematics, which you have all sorts of infinities, which are relative infinities, you may call them. But then you have an absolute infinity, which for mathematics is outside their realms, and it is the subject of theology. So we're all happy with that, right? So we have reason, you have faith, The only trouble comes when you want to put the two things together, reason and faith, as in the encyclica of John Paul II, right? If you want to put them together, then you get into trouble. But if you just say, okay, I have my faith, is against rationality, or it cannot be irrational at least, then it's okay, we wouldn't bother with them, they don't bother with us. So we're all happy, unless the trouble is when you want to do the two things together. But I just wanted to add one thing, if I can, because apropos of the existence, and deconstructing the thing, I don't stop just as you saw, at theology, right? But even in mathematics, for example, I'm not very sure that Pythagoras ever existed. I mean, if you read Pythagoras' lives, the only ones we have, there are three, which were written 800 years after his supposed existence, right? And if you read them, they look like gospels, there are all sorts of miracles, of strange things, for example, one says, Jamblick, one says, one of the students of Pythagoras actually witnessed that in the morning, when Pythagoras went to the river to bathe, right? He heard the student, he heard the river saying to Pythagoras, "Hello, Pythagoras," in the morning, I mean, when I read these things, of course, I don't believe them, that has nothing to do, with believing in Pythagoras' theorem, independently of the fact that he was the one, who proved it first or so on, You can certainly be Pythagorean without Pythagoras. And that's what I usually say to Christians, you can be Christians without Christ, because when I read the Gospels, they don't look very different to me from Pythagoras' life, again, it's a mythological thing, there can be a religion that is based on nothing, or at least, on somebody which is very different from what the Gospels tell, right, with all the miracles. And incidentally, I talk about this, with Benedict XVI, and I thought, well, all those miracles, if you want to convince a rational person, of something, that involves miracles, then you're going to have a difficult life, right? And he said, oh, I don't think, the miracles are distractions, he told me. And indeed, in his books about Jesus, he said, I never talk about miracles, except for one. I mean, it's an axiom, namely the resurrection of Jesus. That's the main thing, but everything else, it's a distraction, and it becomes, more fantastic literature than, so for them, or at least for the high level theologians, religion is a very different thing. And that's why, in a sense, you can even talk to an atheist and have a lot of agreement. Take, for example, the beginning of St. John's Gospel. In the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was near to God, and God was whatever, right? So the identification, and then the incarnation of the Word, the language that becomes meat, or flesh, Well, that's exactly what we do, again, in physics, At the beginning, what is there? There is, there's just the universe, right? And we talk about it, right? And we think, the word in Greek, logos, means not only language, but also rationality, ratios, right? And all scientists would actually believe that the the universe is rational. Because if you don't believe that the world is rational, what do you do? I mean, the scientific laws are expressions of this rationality. And they even believe, that there is a rational, with maybe, capital R, metaphysical, that transcends our rationality, which is what we can put in our, limited head, right? And so what? So that's exactly, it's a translation of the interpretation of the Gospel of St. John, the beginning at least, and it's perfectly compatible with the scientific approach. That is why at the beginning, I said, if somebody tells me, you believe in God, and I asked, what is God? And he says, oh, it's the the rationality that inspires the universe. So I would call it differently, right? I would call it the laws of physics, right? But except for that, we can certainly agree, right? But that has nothing to do with the religion that of the mass, for example, or the temples of the synagogues and so on.
Okay, thank you very much. Jan Woleński, a few final words.
Maybe anecdote. Tarski was very interested in Catholic hierarchy. He was discussing about bishops, archbishops, cardinals, and Naster told him that Alfred, you will write a book on cardinals. And when he published his book, Cardinal Algebras, Knaster sent me a telegram to US because it was after war. Alfred, I told you. This is a story. This is a story. However, you know, it is very risky to apply set theory to theology. Cantor was he used this naive set theory. However, there is no problem now with speaking about collections of truths if we introduce von Neumann Bernays set theory. Set of models, set of truths are classes, not sets. Of course, the problem is that they are still undefined, undefinable in even this richer set theory. Moreover, we had many set theories, whether we adopt axiom of choice, of Martin axioms, or and so on, so on. So once again, Cantor had several religious intuitions with his absolute of sets. However, it was related to very naive intuitions. There is a book about exchange of letters between Cantor and cardinals. Yes, because this problem, as Odifreddi said, was discussed. However, I am against such analogies. You know, I have discussion very frequently with Michael Heller, who is priest, a very competent person and philosopher of science, physics, mathematics. He believes that there is a intersection, rational intersection between theology, not religion, theology and science. And we discussed and I say, no. No, it is not no reason to blame science for it, and also there's no reason to blame theology. And one last maybe sentence. I have a doctoral student, she is now a professor, who once me said, I am a Jewish atheist. So I asked, why? Because atheist is a general point. Oh, no, because it is important in which God you don't believe.
That's certainly the
It's a
case.
very deep state.
Yes, that's right. And I think, you know, that after all, we can still agree, all of us, that both in mathematics and in science and in our lives, which means also in our religions or non-religious attitudes, we have to combine rationality with some sort of faith, believing in the existence of the world or in the regularities of the universe or in the possibilities of scientific explanations, etc. So some sort of assumptions which are really not provable are needed after all. And in this sense, we are all, you know, we all have to continue both the rationalistic, as we as scientists and logicians, and the other traditions. So I think we have to finish at this moment. It's been almost 2 hours anyway. Thank you very much, the speakers. Thank you very much for participation. And I understand that the next meeting will take place in November sometime, and it is on our Logic and Religion list on the general website, so we can meet again. Thank you very much.
Just say that the next session, November 18, and it will be with the mathematician Laurent Laforgue. So I think it will be a nice continuation of the discussion of today. Thanks to everybody.